Hello, I'm Jessica Samuels, and welcome to A Way Forward, presented by Beem Credit Union. I'd like to acknowledge this podcast takes place on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded lands of the Okanagan Syilx people. Our topic today is mental health in a heavy world. And my co-host, CMHA Kelowna CEO Mike Golick, and I will talk about how you can manage your mental health when everything around us just feels turbulent. So Mike, I'm going to start off with the question that we all tend to ask ourselves as we greet each other. How are you?
That's a great question.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, here we go. I would say I'm a little bit tired. Things in the world are a little bit uncertain. It feels like, and we've talked about this before, we made our way through a pandemic and we sort of started to come out the other end, sort of, kind of. And we're now back in a place where there's a lot of uncertainty in the world, which is creating a lot of stress for people. Mm-hmm. And I would say over the past few months, certainly have felt that stress, that uncertainty and that lack of control in regards to your direct influence over some of the challenges that we're currently experiencing. So I think as time goes on, and we'll talk more about this, I've turned the TV off. I'm not watching the news very much at all these days because of the negative impact that it has. And that is making a difference. There's no doubt about that. Mm-hmm. On the same end, how are you doing?
Ditto. It's really interesting. So when we approach this podcast and we kind of have the mental health topics that we know we're going to cover. There's those things that impact our mental health. We've covered them. We will cover more. And then there's these things that kind of rise to the top as you scroll, as you watch, change channels, you talk to your friends, you talk to family members. And I just was noticing this theme of like, what the heck people are going on. And then actually it was my brother who asked me, he's like, so do you ever talk about mental health in like the news? And then I said, no, maybe, should I? And then I saw a post on social media from Harvard Business Review that actually was a cute little graphic and said how to manage your mental health with the news. And I said, okay. And I really looked at how I was feeling, and I'm the same. I'm feeling a little bit better than I have been, but I just feel like I have been stuck in this angst, uncertainty-driven angst.
Yep.
And really that's what we want to talk about today. So, we talked about turbulent times, and how they manifest for everybody. You mentioned something like, the pandemic. And I feel like we're in a time right now where there's things that are happening across the world that have a chance to negatively impact our personal lives. And as I was getting ready and researching this episode, I said, that's really, it's those bits and pieces that have the opportunity to affect you personally that really get to us. So that's what we're gonna dig into today. So hope you're ready for that. Yeah. Yeah, you are. So when we're talking about those things, so we're talking about political turbulence, we're talking about natural disasters, and as we go into this, I want to use the term news as a general term. I'm not here to blame it on social media or news outlets. What I'm talking about is the taking in of information, the essence of the definition of news. And it's this 24-hour news cycle. Social media, television, and I have to tell you, even conversation with friends that has me up here. Mm-hmm.
Well, it can feel like it's never ending, right? And ultimately that you don't really get any reprieve from it. I think as human beings, like we're hardwired to get information, and to try and understand what's taking place and to make sense of things, and to try to get some level of certainty. That's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, more information may in fact make you feel like you've got a sense of what's going on or have it under control. From a mental health perspective, and the potential negative side of things is the stress that it causes, and how it can make someone's experience of mental health worse instead of better.
And when we talk about those personal impacts as well, it's all of that's heightened. So you referenced some emotional things that our body can go through, mental health, effects on mental health. Talk a little bit more about what the body goes through, because this is a thing, as they say. This is a real thing.
It's a real thing. Yeah. I mean, certainly how news can impact us is it can result in fight or flight. And, it's not hundreds of years ago whereby, we're getting chased by bears or lions, and that needs to kick in order for us to survive. However, we haven't evolved that much. And news in particular that impacts us directly can have the same fight or flight impact on us. And what happens is our sympathetic nervous system goes into overload. It releases adrenaline, it releases other stress hormones, including cortisol, which ultimately you're having a physiological reaction to that information. And the challenge with that in the long term is if that's not managed, that level of stress and consistently being in fight or flight can result in ongoing and chronic physical health concerns as well.
It's interesting to me that fight or flight, like you mentioned, is coming up from, that instinct, that basic instinct for us, which came from, live or die, eat or don't eat, be eaten by, any kind of predator. Yeah. And we're talking about now a news or information source that doesn't have that actualized immediate threat, but it's still it's still eliciting that response in us. And we're in this really vicious cycle because we're seeking out this information so that we can feel more certain about the world, but it's the information that's causing us to get this high response.
Well, and there's another physical element to this too, right? And as we seek out information, we can ultimately get a surge of dopamine, which means that we go back and we seek out that information again and seek out that information again. And ultimately that can become like a negative reinforcing loop. And it's something that we do, certainly unintentionally, but in our search for certainty and in our search for understanding, there are things that we do that do the exact opposite and can be harmful for us.
This is like where doom scrolling came in. Like somehow that hit of dopamine that you mentioned is where you just can't turn away from any of the headline, or that you're driving down the road and you see the police lights and the ambulance and the fire truck, and it's not going to be good, but it's all you can do to not slow down and look or then go to the headlines and see what happens. Yeah. Like this, it's an interesting phenomena that I think has been talked more about post-pandemic.
I think so for sure. I mean, I think in part with the pandemic, of course, how we communicated with each other changed, right? The use of, our devices and texting and those kinds of things. Like, you get a text, there's a ding, there's a hit of dopamine right there, right? Mm-hmm. And it reinforces by sending that response and getting another one that this continues to build. And it's a world that we live in, and it's a reality that we face right now, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, I'm feeling it. The folks in my network are feeling it. You're feeling it. I feel like we're not alone in this. And I think recognizing that, I think what I wanted to do here today is acknowledge to folks that this is a very real feeling. It's okay that we're all having. And there's actually, it's not just a feeling, we're actually having a physiological response.
Yep.
And to recognize that. And so, of course, when we get to this point, we want to say, how best can we manage this? Because this doesn't feel good. I mean, before we get to that part, I wouldn't mind going back to what you had talked about. Like, it can't be good for our bodies overall to be operating in this mode for any length of time. Like, I feel like, and I don't want to catastrophize anything, but I'm really feeling like in the world, we've just been bracing for uncertainty since, 2020, March 13th, 2020. And I wonder if this is also like an echo response that we're still kind of coming off this 4 or 5 years later.
Well, it's certainly a learned response. There's no doubt about that. I think it's a physiological response to a perceived threat. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. There's lots of similarities back to 2000. So we've certainly learned how to respond and react to things. And I think ultimately it's absolutely normal. It's a normal human physiological response. How we manage that response is, key in terms of chronic stress not turning into disease, uncertainty and stress not becoming, a diagnosed mental illness. And there are things that we can do to try to manage ourselves in the face of that. Right.
Okay. So let's focus on that now, because, in that vein of thought, where if we feel like we've kind of been in and out of this for a few years now, we might almost run the risk of feeling like this is how things should be or are okay to be right now. And as we've indicated, it can do some real damage mentally and physically. So what's the first step in managing this? I can imagine to recognize that you're having these responses. You're scrolling, you're reading a headline, you're hearing a friend, and you notice this fight or flight, angst rise up. Like, walk us through kind of what we have to do to manage this.
Well, I think before you can take action, you have to be aware that something is taking place. So part of it is noticing what's going on for you. Like, how are you feeling, right? Like, are you feeling stressed? How does that feel ultimately in your body? Are there friends that are making comments around how you're showing up different? Are you consistently either scrolling through the headlines, or is the TV on in the background and the news is going 24/7? Right. I think it's a matter of paying attention and being aware. And as we identify some of those signs and identify what's taking place, then ultimately there's some actions that we can take on.
Right. And you mentioned a few of them. We can talk about that off the top, and even what you're doing. One of them is, you said, recognizing that you probably shouldn't be feeling this way. It's not good to feel this way. So then what's the next step? And you mentioned yourself limiting the taking in that information.
Yeah, over the last little while, and I can't say really what's driven it, but I just think I just got tired of the same thing over and over, and the doom and the rest of it, and needed just to take a break. Like continuing to see it wasn't good. My stress level certainly had gone up, and I would notice that physically. I have a friend who I totally give him credit, because he struggles with a diagnosed mental illness, and he has struggled for a number of years. And through the course of the fall, as we went through a provincial election, as we went through the election in the United States, we'd have conversations, and he would set a boundary, and he'd say, listen, over the course of time, I've come to learn that this isn't good for me. And I ruminate, and I can't stop thinking about it. And so I'm making the choice not to have this conversation, which was like groundbreaking. And I was really proud of my friend, having seen him struggle through a lot of things in his life. And he had developed that level of awareness. What do you do when you're not doing those things? Well, we get into some of the things we always talk about, right? So mindfulness, practicing mindfulness, physical activity, going outside, getting some fresh air. Like, those are all things that we can do to take care of ourselves physically and sort of remove ourselves from the negativity in the news that comes with that.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. So your friend really set a boundary, and I appreciate that conversation, because, you know, I can say, well, I'm only going to look at my phone for this long. I'm only going to, and we have at home, it was just by default. We always had a 24-hour news station on in the background as we made dinner, and I could just feel myself. Ugh. And it wasn't even the information that they were sharing. It was the sound of that particular was starting to really just put me in an irksome mood. And so you can manage that, and then you do all the things, and then you go to work the next day, or you hang out with your friends, and they're like, "Oh, did you hear?" And I'm like, "No, I've just managed to work my way through this."
Now, I'm thinking we may have established, because I remember back to the one around the holidays. If Jessica's in an irksome mood, go outside for a walk.
I do, yeah. It's, you know, which can prove difficult in the winter months, and that's whole other episode.
It can result in all sorts of other things.
Yeah. Have a little exercise room downstairs away from people. But yeah, go outside, and mindfulness and all those pieces. But then there's some other things too that I've been practicing. So not just default having the TV on, first of all, or the TV to news on, but then, you know, you go back to that idea that you want to be informed. I don't want to put my head in the sand, because I don't want to be caught off guard by some other craziness. So one of the things that I was doing is, signing up for like news alerts. But I just want to asterisk this. Not the phone jump out at you. Oh my goodness, this is happening news alerts. Just old school email, like, hey, when you're ready to look at this, have a look at it.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happens. I see that I have an email. I see it's from various news outlets. I may or may not look at the headline. And then I may or may not, you know, click to read more. And this has been really helpful, because I feel like I can be informed, because I like to feel like I'm informed. But it feels like it's more on my time.
Sure.
So, and through the research with this, I've actually, there's some discussion about reading the news. Like
versus watching.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting to
Yeah.
me. So it's
difference.
less. Yeah.
Yeah. The difference it can have in terms of your response. I found it quite surprising as well.
Yes. So the idea being read it as opposed to watching it, because the watching is that visual piece that we're all trained to be incorporated to kind of lean into, is actually, again, that piece that's doing us harm.
Well, and there was one study that was highlighted as we prepped for this, which showed that within 14 minutes of watching the news, people started to have symptoms start to show, right? Which is, cause for concern.
I'm having symptoms just by you telling me that I've got 14 minutes. I feel like I should put a little timer on and be like a countdown.
Yeah. Yeah. When you hit 13, you're good. Don't let it get to 15.
Don't get let to 15.
No,
go for a walk.
It'll get irksome. And then watch out.
Well, and adding levity is important too. So some good tips there in terms of managing your information intake. How do we know, Mike, when it's gotten to be too much. So how do I know when, my walk in my neighborhood or some mindfulness or yoga or journaling is not going to cut it in terms of managing my anxiety, my stress, and leading into depression when it comes to these uncertain times?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're going to notice changes that are prolonged, right? We've talked about depression before, and you look at things like, appetite, and whether there's a significant change there, sleep, mood, like irritability, low mood, the inability to focus. I've noticed that I've had some of that going on recently, and I don't think it's just due to my age. So there's a number of physical symptoms. The part that we need to pay attention to is, again, here and there, that's normal. When they become a repetitive pattern, when they start to show up for periods of time, and when they start to negatively impact your day-to-day functioning, that's probably the time that you want to consider looking at alternatives that go beyond, the mindfulness and the going outside, and that can include, speaking to a professional.
And you mentioned off the top as well, if you're somebody who already struggles or experiences mental illness, depression, this type of what we've been talking about today, these news cycles, this information piece, you have a higher likelihood also of being impacted.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in that case, I think one of the things to be aware of, and this comes back to self-awareness, but what are some of the key triggers? Like, what are those things that you just know, if you see or experience, are going to be the ones that are going to potentially set things off, and then look for and try to plan to address those as they come up.
Right. Okay, so self-awareness is really key in all of this, but certainly whenever we're talking about mental health concerns or things that can trigger it, but particularly with this, on that constant information source, just being really self-aware of how you're taking it in and how you're feeling.
Yep, for sure. And then one of the things that gets talked about is embracing optimism in your life.
Yes.
Right? Whether that's with friends, whether that's with family. What are some of the things that bring you joy? And to do some of those things, because they definitely can help in terms of making you feel better through what can be really trying times.
It just, when you said that, it got me thinking about, because I'm always thinking about in other episodes, that idea of joy or fun, and like as adults, we don't like playing.
Yeah.
Right. As kids, like, go in your room and play, go outside and play or whatever. And adults, maybe we need a bit more of that. Another episode topic for another time.
I think we need a whole lot more of that.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Beem Credit Union supports mental health initiatives across British Columbia because caring for each other builds stronger, more connected communities. United as one, Beem's founding credit unions now serve 190,000 members across BC.